everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, February 10th, where we are continuing our discussion about the sonnets. You'll remember we talked about how Shakespeare likely wrote these sonnets, these poems, during times of plague when the theater houses were closed. And there are 154 sonnets. Not that we are reading 154 sonnets, we are reading 6 sonnets. None of these sonnets have titles, so we refer to them by the number that they've been given by scholars or by their first name. We can expect to find a 10-syllable line in these sonnets, so the meter or the beat is very similar to a heartbeat. Ba-bum, ba-bum, bum-bum. It's a sound that Shakespeare oftentimes utilized in his dramas as well. And we can predict the rhyme scheme being A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then lastly, G, G. Those last two lines that rhyme together. And we know that the subject matter has to be something that's serious enough to warrant a sonnet. And that the sonnets have been divided up into two groups, known as the earlier set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets. And last class, we discussed 3 representative sonnets from the earlier set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton, which has led, of course, to a lot of debate as to whether or not there was a romantic relationship involved. But if you read those sonnets, you'll see that they are less about romance or sex and more about flattery and appreciation of beauty, which would not have been unusual at the time, and also it makes a lot of political sense to flatter your patron because of the economic and social support a patron would offer. So today, what we are doing is talking about 3 of the later sonnets, and this is Sonnet 127, 130, and 151. And as I suggested for the sonnets, and actually for Shakespeare language as a whole, read it out loud or listen to somebody else reading it. And if you'll remember, Sir Patrick Stewart read all of the sonnets aloud when we were on lockdown, a sonnet a day, and uploaded that onto the internet. So I've been sharing those links with you. I also shared a link where you could have the sonnets read in their entirety by a nonprofit organization if you so wanted to do that. And I suggest you try to paraphrase the sonnets, put it in your own language, and then reread the sonnets multiple times. Try to identify themes, try to identify imagery. So, in other words, imagery or symbolism, language that represents something else, metaphor, comparing two dissimilar things, rhyme, the ending of the words having similar sounds, alliteration, the beginning of the words having similar sounds. And I chose these 3 particular sonnets because I think they really illustrate the difficulty in trying to find some sort of a definitive biography for Shakespeare through his sonnets, because you'll oftentimes have sonnets that are contradictory to one another. And Sonnet 130, My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, is a good example. But before I get to Sonnet 130, I wanted to talk about Sonnet 127. In the old age, black was not counted fair. And I've provided not only a link with Sir Patrick Stewart reading that sonnet, but I've also provided a link where you could find that on the Folger Shakespeare Library webpage. And this particular sonnet illustrates what some of the expectations of the time were for beauty, and how Shakespeare really questioned many of those expectations. In the old age, black was not counted fair, but now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives, in disgrace. Therefore my mistress' eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited that they mourners seem, At such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. And in the beginning, when he's talking about in the old age, and of one way of perhaps paraphrasing that is in the good old days, black or dark features, which is usually what we assume, not necessarily dark skin, when we talk about these sonnets that are written to the dark lady, a woman with dark hair and dark eyes. Black was not counted fair, the idea of fair representing beauty in this particular instance. Or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. The idea of family and rank gets to the idea of chain of being, that one was ranked on the chain of being, that hierarchy in society based on one's status or one's family name. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case in Shakespeare's examination, and not only sonnets, but also the dramas as well. But now is Black Beauty's successive heir. And again, that idea about family name and heirs and succession gets down to the idea of birthright. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face. This is in reference to unnatural beauty, the use of cosmetics to hide natural beauty. Sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower. And, we talk about Shakespeare having timeless and universal concerns, or Shakespeare examining timeless and universal concerns. Can only imagine what he would have to say about social media and false beauty in today's world. But is profaned if not lives in disgrace. So therefore my mistress's eyes, and at the time a mistress meant a woman, are raven black. Her eyes so suited that they mourners seem. And I think this is something that's interesting about Shakespeare, and that oftentimes we talk about Shakespearean tragedies as perhaps the epitome of his work. And there's a kind of dark beauty in the Shakespearean tragedies, a dark beauty that's also referenced in terms of this dark lady. And such who, not born fair, not born in terms of light-colored hair or eyes, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. This sonnet is all about the idea of facade and deception, and it's something that we will definitely see in Shakespeare's dramas. And as we move on to Sonnet 129, we'll see the exact opposite of what we saw in his earlier set of sonnets. Perhaps his most famous sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which was filled with hyperbole, extreme exaggeration, because there is no such thing as perfection, despite the sonnet maintaining that this person far exceeded perfection, which is a summer's day, because summer's days aren't perfect, they have imperfection. But here, in this particular sonnet, in sonnet 130. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I've seen roses damask red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare. This is a sonnet of realism rather than a sonnet of idealization. And talking about the idea that my mistresses, again, mistress would have meant a woman, they're nothing like the sun, that eyes can't outshine the sun. Coral is certainly redder than lips. Skin can't really be as white as new fallen snow. Hair is not silky, but oftentimes is, he calls it black wired. And that roses might have red and white, but you're not going to find that in the cheeks of a human being. And perfume is sweet, but not necessarily the breath of a human. And by reek, it meant exhaled. It didn't have the negative connotations of today. And that, of course, no woman's voice. And notice that this sonnet is very obviously written to a female, unlike some of the earlier sonnets where it was much more ambiguous. That music is much more melodic than a voice. And while this author admits he never saw a goddess walk, but his mistress, when she walks, she treads on the ground. She doesn't float like a goddess. Again, those last two lines that sort of serve as a summary. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare, my love as extraordinary, as any she belied with false compare, any love that was misrepresented with untruths. So perhaps this sonnet of realism is more powerful than the sonnet of idealization, because we all have flaws. And the last sonnet that I have selected for us, I very deliberately selected because it's quite sexual in nature. And I wanted to be able to show you how Shakespeare could oftentimes do that. Love is too young to know what conscience is. And while I'm reading these sonnets to you, I very much encourage that you listen to Patrick Stewart, the great Shakespearean trained actor, read these sonnets, because I can in no way match Patrick Stewart's performance. But Sonnet 151 reads, "Love is too young to know what conscience is. Yet who knows not conscience is born of love? Then, gentle cheater, urge not my amiss, lest guilty of my faults thy sweet self prove. For thou betraying me, I do betray my nobler's part to my gross body's treason. My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. Flesh stays no farther reason, but rising at thy name doth point out thee as his triumphant prize. Proud of this pride, he is contented thy poor trudge to be, to stand in thy affairs, fall by thy side. No want of conscience hold it that I call her love, for whose dear love I rise and fall." And this is all about, the morality of trying to keep one's passion in check and to control the desires of the flesh for a more earthly love. But this bawdy sonnet, which talks about love is too young to know what conscience is, that the initial stages of love, you don't feel conscience, regret, remorse. That only happens after love occurs. And that his body is a cheater, in effect, because he's trying to control his bodily responses and he can't. And the body betrays him. And his nobler part, his soul, is ultimately under the servitude of his gross body's treason. My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. Again, the idea is that he can conquer these lustful thoughts. But flesh stays no farther reason, but the flesh will not listen. Rising at thy name doth point out thee as his triumphant prize. This idea of rising and falling is also a reference to the phallus and erection. Proud of this pride. Notice all these P words. Proud, pride. Swelling with pride, but also swelling with sexual excitement. And of course, penis is another P word. He is contented thy poor drudge to be. In other words, that the flesh is a slave to this person's beauty, this woman's beauty. He is contented thy poor drudge to be, to stand in thy affairs and fall by thy side. And again, the idea is that this is the rising and falling of erection. Nor want of conscience hold it that I call her love. Notice the feminine pronoun here. For whose dear love I rise and fall. This gives you just a little bit of a sense of what Shakespeare's sonnets were like. I wanted to start the semester this way to give us some practice with Shakespearean language. And What should have happened at this point is that you should have received an email from the GCC library. So if you have not received an email, please contact me. The email should have indicated that you have access to the stage version from the Reconstructed Globe Theater of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which happens to be our next play. And my hope has been that while we've been talking about sonnets, you've been reading A Midsummer Night's Dream, so that when we begin talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream next class, what would be ideal? Well, I'm well aware that life isn't always ideal. You would have read A Midsummer Night's Dream in its entirety. So as we're talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream and watching a performance, you are reading our next play, which happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. But if you have not received an email from the GCC library providing you with instructions on how to access that performance from the Reconstructed Globe Theater, please let me know. And copyright is indeed an issue with this performance, so it's available only through the GCC library link and only for a certain period of time, through the ending of February. But I wanted you to be able to see this particular performance, first because it's well done, but secondly, because it's in the Reconstructed Globe Theater. And we talked a little bit about the Globe Theater and how the Globe would have influenced performances during the time. Now, obviously, they've modernized some of the elements of the drama. I'm not going to give away any spoilers until you actually see it in its entirety. We'll talk a little bit more about that next class, about the way that I recommend that you view it in pieces. I'm going to give you some natural breaks, though some of you might have already wanted to start to see it. And ideally, I always tell students 3 viewings. I know that might not necessarily be possible, but the first is basically just for plot, the second for analysis, and the third for greater discussion or writing. That said, again, I know that might not necessarily be possible, especially because I recommend 3 readings of every piece of literature that we read. Again, the first for the plot, the second for analysis, and the third to refresh your memory. So if you've already read A Midsummer Night's Dream or you've already seen a performance, you will indeed have an advantage. It's almost like that video that I had you watch about the 3 little pigs in terms of updating that with Renaissance language. Once you know the plot, you can really appreciate the nuances of the language. But first, you need to know the plot. So in terms of A Midsummer Night's Dream, this means that we are moving from the sonnets into Shakespeare's comedies. It's thought that Shakespeare wrote his comedies early on in his career. Again, he might not necessarily have written everything in chronological order, and scholars even debate the dates in which these plays were written and performed, which is why you'll oftentimes see the letter C next to the date of a play, because that means circa, around the time of. But the comedies tend to be less intense, certainly, than the histories or the tragedies. The titles don't necessarily focus on a specific character, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, rather than a title like Macbeth or Othello, which focuses on a main character. Lots of music and dance in the comedies, and one of the things that you might miss when you read the comedies, you might miss a lot of the music and the dance, and it's something that you can see with the Globe performance. And also the idea that we think that the comedies were performed either immediately before or after wedding ceremonies. So the tone should be rather lighthearted. And while we think of comedies as focusing on humor, the main point of a Shakespearean comedy was to examine love and all of the mix-ups and misunderstandings that can occur because of love. But in the ending, what we end up with is a happy ending. What that means is no death and either marriage or the promise of marriage. I like to joke that you can decide whether or not you see that as a happy ending or not. Think of it more as an ensemble cast rather than necessarily stars. That said, you'll see how Shakespeare likes to mix things up, because we will read 2 comedies and watch 2 comedies over the course of the semester. This comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream, is set in the world of fantasy and magic. So if you like fantasy and magic, you'll probably enjoy this play very much. If you're someone who enjoys a more realistic setting, then you might enjoy Much Ado About Nothing, our second comedy, which is coming after this, which is very much set in the world of reality. And Much Ado About Nothing sort of anticipates one of Shakespeare's tragedies. So even though Much Ado About Nothing ends happily, you might be familiar with the tragedy Othello. If you're not, you will be, because Othello is one of the tragedies we'll be reading, and you'll see how Much Ado About Nothing is really, in some ways, a kind of comedic telling of Othello. But don't want to necessarily get ahead of myself too much. Midsummer Night's Dream is oftentimes a play that's done in the junior high school or high school level because, again, it's rather lighthearted. And one of the things that oftentimes isn't discussed about A Midsummer Night's Dream is how incredibly bawdy the play is. There are lots of references to sex and lots of sex jokes. Some of the comedy is quite physical, so you'll see that in the Globe production where you actually see a lot of slapstick. And again, we aren't necessarily sure. We don't have eyewitnesses to tell us exactly what could have happened. But the audience would have been very actively involved in productions, especially the groundlings who would have been standing right next to the stage. And at the time of Shakespeare, the groundlings basically paid the least amount of money, so they were considered to be the least desirable seats because there weren't seats, they had to stand, and there wasn't any protection from the weather. There wasn't any kind of awning or roofing. And now if you were to go to a production from the reconstructed Globe Theater, well, that's really the seat to be in or the place to stand as a groundling, because you really do get the best view and you have the opportunity of being able to interact with the actors who we think would have been actually involved by going into the stage itself and interacting with the audience. And we believe that in addition to all the things Shakespeare did, he actually served as a bit actor in some of his plays. Not too surprising, I suppose, because when you think about contemporary directors, they oftentimes will do something very similar. And while Shakespeare was multi-talented because he was writing and he was directing and he was acting, I think that what you will see with A Midsummer Night's Dream is a very contemporary play in many respects. That's another of Shakespeare's strengths, because in the end it talks about all of the challenges associated with love. And if you've ever been in love, you will probably recognize some of these challenges. I tell you right now, this play is deliberately confusing, in part because of the message that love itself is confusing. The names are very similar to one another. Hermia and Helena, for instance, both start with H, in part to illustrate that one lover is just as good as another, even though we maintain that our lover is unique. Shakespeare is examining the fact that one can substitute for another easily. And if the names are different, like Demetrius and Lysander, their personalities are so similar they could be easily interchanged with one another. You will see lots of plots going on and subplots, and they're all related to one another. And when we think about the five pyramid structure of a Shakespearean play, with thinking about a pyramid, on the left bottom side would be Act 1, where we're introduced to characters. And then we begin to get a rising of tension in Act 2. This is where you begin the ascension of the pyramid. And then you get to the pinnacle of the pyramid, which would be Act 3. That's the point of the pyramid. And that would be the height of conflict and tension. And Act 4, which would be on the right side of the pyramid, would be the beginning of descent. And then finally, Act 5, which would be resolution. And A Midsummer Night's Dream perhaps is a little bit different because it seems as if the play could end in Act 4. But trust me, Act 5 is incredibly important and serves as a mirror to what we've seen with the first four acts. Because there are so many characters and because it is so confusing, what we will see is lots of love relationships being manipulated through magic. So people will fall in and out of love with one another very quickly, in part to illustrate the theme that love is a fickle thing and that love is quite superficial. So there's some negative commentary here about love in some respects. I recommend that you keep a chart of all of the characters just so that you can keep the plot straight. We will certainly talk about the plot as well as talking about a production. And very soon we'll start talking about papers as well. Not that your first paper is due until the mid part of the semester, but now that we are getting into the dramas themselves, you have the option of being able to choose A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing for your first paper. So I wanted to talk about that. And yes, it is possible to write about the sonnets for your first paper, but writing about a poem, a short poem in particular, is very different than writing about a play as a whole. So what I'll do is I'll give you suggested paper topics now that we are beginning our reading of the dramas, and we'll talk a little bit about those as well. And I always encourage early papers, but I'm hopeful that by the midpoint of the semester, everybody would have submitted in their first paper. So, in addition to reading A Midsummer Night's Dream and hopefully getting ahead by reading Much Ado About Nothing, your job at this point is to answer our discussion forum question. And as you know, you are not required to respond to your peers, but you certainly can. You could think of it almost as raising your hand in an academic classroom. And you don't need to start a new post, by the way, when you are responding. And that said, what you are required to do is to read all of your classmates' comments and my responses in turn. So you can see that at this point I've started responding to you. That'll give you a good idea of what we would have talked about during a class discussion. So last class, for your discussion forum response, I asked you to identify your favorite sonnet from the early set of sonnets that we had read in class. So this class, I'm going to ask you to identify your favorite set of sonnets from the later set of sonnets that we've read in this class. In other words, either sonnet 127, 130, 151, talking about which of those three was your favorite, and more importantly, why. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Take care. And again, do contact me if you have not heard from the GCC library about the link for the performance for Midsummer at the reconstructed Globe Theater. Take care. Bye-bye.